The Libyan desert doesn't hide anything. No tree line, no fog, no cover. Just flat ground running to the horizon in every direction, which is exactly why an outpost of German soldiers, part of Rommel's Afrika Korps, felt safe enough to sleep without a full watch that night in 1942. Rudolf Schneider was Rommel's driver, an agriculture student conscripted into uniform, kept close to the field marshal because his English was good enough to be useful. He and Rommel drove out on reconnaissance the next morning, deep into terrain that should have been empty of anyone but their own men. It wasn't. 14 German soldiers lay where they'd fallen asleep. No gunfire had woken the rest of the camp. No perimeter alarm had gone off. Each man's throat had been opened while he slept, and whoever had done it was gone before dawn. Next to the last body, someone had left a knife. Curved, single-edged, unmistakably deliberate. A kukri, the traditional blade carried by the Gurkha regiments of the British Indian Army. Schneider picked it up. He kept it for the rest of his life, 68 years by his own account, still turning it over when he tried to explain to people what that morning had felt like. No unit had claimed the raid. No radio traffic mentioned it. There was nothing to investigate because there was nothing left to interrogate. Just 14 dead men, an empty desert, and a knife that had clearly been left on purpose. That kind of silence doesn't happen by accident. And it wasn't isolated. Versions of that same story surface again and again across the Mediterranean theater, in North Africa, at Monte Cassino, along the Gothic line in Italy. German and Italian troops facing Gurkha units didn't just lose battles to them. They developed something closer to dread. Some of that dread was earned honestly in blood at close range. Over 250,000 Gurkhas served the British Empire during the Second World War, absorbing more than 32,000 casualties and earning somewhere between 10 and 12 Victoria Crosses. The exact figure is inconsistently recorded even in official summaries, which tells you something about how underdocumented this theater of the war remains. But real battlefield lethality is only half of what built the legend. The other half was manufactured deliberately, systematically, by British intelligence officers working in a requisition building in Cairo, who understood that a myth aimed correctly could do the work of several armored divisions. This is a story about both halves, and it starts a long time before Rommel ever set foot in the desert. The relationship goes back to 1814, when the British East India Company invaded the Kingdom of Nepal, expecting an easy campaign and got a brutal one instead. Gurkha forces, though outnumbered, inflicted enough damage that the British reversed their assessment entirely. Rather than crush them, they wanted them in uniform. Recruitment into British service began soon after. The fear that would define the Second World War, though, was born in the trenches of the First. In December 1914, near La Bassée in France, German troops encountered Gurkha regiments in close quarters, trench fighting for the first time. A German lieutenant named Alexander Pfeiffer recorded his impressions in a diary afterward, describing, in effect, soldiers who fought with a ferocity his own men hadn't been prepared for, and who used their knives in ways that stuck in the memory of everyone who survived the encounter. That memory didn't stay contained to one diary. It circulated. It became something closer to institutional folklore inside the German army, passed from veterans to recruits over the following 2 decades, long before anyone suspected there would be a second war to fight the same unites in. By 1940, Britain needed every soldier it could raise. France had fallen. The empire was stretched dangerously thin. The Indian Army expanded to over 2.5 million volunteers, and the Gurkha Brigade grew from 20 pre-war battalions to 46, more than 250,000 men, deployed across the Middle East, North Africa, Italy, and Burma. Because Nepal was an independent kingdom, not a colony, Britain couldn't simply conscript its citizens. The British minister in Kathmandu had to formally request permission from the Maharaja, who gave it without hesitation. If Britain won, he said, Nepal would win with it. If Britain lost, Nepal would lose with it. His only condition was that returning soldiers undergo a Hindu purification ceremony before re-entering the kingdom. Selection was brutal by design. Recruits were required to run 5 kilometers uphill carrying a wicker basket loaded with 25 kilograms of rocks, strapped across the forehead. The men who passed went into regiments whose war cry, Ayo Gorkali, roughly "the Gurkhas are upon you," was less a battle chant than an announcement. The British had a theory for why certain ethnic groups made better soldiers than others, and they called it the martial race doctrine, the belief that communities like the Maegar and Gurung of central Nepal were biologically and culturally suited to warfare in a way other populations weren't. Historians today are largely unified in rejecting the science behind it. Most describe it as a piece of colonial-era pseudo-anthropology that conveniently justified recruiting cheap, loyal manpower from specific communities while denying the same trust to others. But the doctrine shaped recruitment policy for over a century. And by the time the Gurkha Brigade needed to more than double in size for the Second World War, standards built on that theory had to bend. New battalions absorbed men from outside the traditionally favored groups, and experienced officers and NCOs were milked out of veteran units to seed the new ones, leaving some frontline battalions dangerously thin on the exact experience that had built the reputation in the first place. That's the raw material. What happened to it next is where the story gets complicated. April 1943, Tunisia. The Allied 8th Army needed to break Rommel's defensive line at Wadi Akarit, and the plan required capturing the heavily fortified Fatnasa Heights under cover of darkness. Subedar Lal Bahadur Thapa, a senior Gurkha officer, ended up commanding 2 sections after his superior was pulled away. Ahead of them, a steep, narrow cleft in the rock, guarded by an anti-tank gun and several machine gun positions. Any gunfire from Thapa's men would have brought the entire garrison down on them in the confined space, so there was no gunfire. Thapa's men moved up the cleft in total silence and eliminated the outer sentries with kukris and bayonets alone. When the alarm finally did go up, Thapa broke cover and charged 200 feet up an open cliff face under grenade and machine gun fire, with only 2 riflemen still behind him. At the top, he personally killed 4 more German soldiers with his kukri and a revolver. The line broke. The 8th Army secured its bridgehead. Thapa received the first Victoria Cross awarded to a Gurkha soldier in the Second World War. Night work like this depended on more than nerve. Gurkha patrols reportedly learned to identify a sleeping enemy in pitch darkness by feel alone, running a hand along a boot to check how the laces were tied, since German, Italian, and British forces each knotted them differently. It's a small detail, almost trivial on its own, but it's the kind of preparation that turns a raid into something closer to surgery than combat. That's real, documented, cited, uncontested. But while men like Thapa were doing this with knives and bare nerve in the Tunisian desert, something else entirely was being built 500 miles away in an office in Cairo that had, until recently, been a brothel. The man running that office was Lieutenant Colonel Dudley Clark, head of a unit he'd named A-Force, a name chosen in part because it hinted at airborne and meant nothing at all. Clark was eccentric even by the standards of wartime intelligence. He'd later be arrested in Madrid dressed in women's clothing, under circumstances that were never fully explained, even in his own post-war account. Clark's job was deception, convincing German high command that Allied forces were bigger, better positioned, and more threatening than they actually were. And by 1943, he'd identified a resource sitting in plain sight. The Germans were already afraid of the Gurkhas. All he had to do was make that fear bigger than reality. So A-Force invented the 6th Gurkha Parachute Brigade. On paper, it blended one real unit, the 6th Battalion, 6th Gurkha Regiment, with two entirely fictional ones, the 160th and 161st Gurkha Parachute Regiments. Clark's team fed the story to German intelligence through double agents carrying forged training documents, generated fake radio traffic to simulate brigade-level communications, and deliberately planted insignia patches in Cairo cafes, where Axis intelligence was known to fish for scraps. It worked almost too well. German analysts, already primed by 2 decades of Gurkha folklore, found the Phantom Brigade entirely plausible. Why wouldn't the same soldiers who'd been silently gutting sentries in the desert also be training as elite paratroopers? Running in parallel to Clark's fictional army was a second operation, quieter and more troubling. The political warfare executive's campaign of what internal documents called black propaganda. PWE officers deliberately spread rumors among Axis troops that Gurkhas practiced cannibalism. They ordered select units to shave their heads entirely, leaving only the traditional Hindu tupi, then leaked word to German intelligence that the tuft functioned as a biological signaling device, a wireless antenna for coordinating supernatural attacks. Not every British officer was comfortable with this. Many who served alongside Gurkha regiments respected them as rigorously trained professionals and viewed the propaganda as an offensive, dehumanizing caricature of men fighting and dying under their own command. The disagreement went nowhere, though. The war effort took priority, and the campaign continued. Clark himself very nearly lost control of the operation before it even matured. In late 1941, while he was away building intelligence contacts in Turkey and Spain, a rival officer, Colonel Ralph Bagnold, was appointed Chief Deception Officer for the Middle East and began absorbing A-Force's units into his own command. Clark returned to find his carefully built illusion machine being dismantled by his own side. It took direct intervention from above to remove Bagnold and hand control back to Clark, weeks before the deception campaign supporting El Alamein needed to be airtight. March 1944, Monte Cassino. The abbey on the hill above the Gustav Line had just been reduced to rubble by Allied bombers, a decision that remains contested to this day, since the German commander defending the position, General Friedrich von Zenger und Etterlin, later insisted he had expressly forbidden his troops from occupying the site before the bombing. Von Zenger was an unusual figure to find commanding a German panzer corps, a former Rhodes Scholar at Oxford, a devout lay Benedictine, and privately no admirer of Hitler at all. Once the abbey was destroyed, the ruins made a nearly perfect defensive fortress for the Fallschirmjäger, who moved in afterward, a fortress the Allies had built for the Germans by trying to deny it to them. Below those ruins sat a rocky outcrop the Allies called Hangman's Hill, named for the silhouette of a shattered cable car pylon that resembled gallows. Captain M.R. Drinkhall led C Company of the 1st Battalion, 9th Gurkha Rifles, up onto that ledge and got them there. Then they were stuck. Daylight resupply meant certain death. Night drops mostly missed. The Germans held the higher ground and could see almost every inch of the Gurkha position. They held it anyway. 9 days, on 2 days of rations, under repeated Fallschirmjäger counterattacks. At some point during the siege, A German officer appeared on a ridge 50 feet above the Gurkha position and demanded in English that they surrender. There was no ammunition left to shoot back with if he decided to press the point. The 60 men below him had no cards left to play, except one. They said nothing. They simply looked back at him. He withdrew. Whether it was the silence, the uncertainty of what he was actually facing, or something else, the demand wasn't repeated. When the order to abandon the position finally came, the survivors slipped through German lines in the dark and vanished before the Fallschirmjäger realized the hill was empty. Here's what makes that standoff more than just a story of nerve. At the exact same time, dozens of German divisions across the Mediterranean and the Balkans were being held in reserve, not to fight a real threat, but to guard against Clark's fictional Gurkha paratroopers. The same institutional fear that made one German major hesitate on a cliff had convinced Hitler's high command to freeze real combat power in place against an enemy that had never trained, never assembled, and never existed. Two forms of the same weapon deployed at the same moment. Authentic soldiers whose reputation for silent, merciless close combat was completely real, and a fabricated order of battle, exploiting that same reputation to paralyze strategic decision-making an entire theater away. Neither one alone explains what happened at Cassino or in the Balkans. Together, they do. Not every historian credits Clark's deception with quite that much power. To be fair, some argue Hitler's obsession with the Balkans, driven largely by the region's oil reserves, would have kept German divisions stationed there regardless of any fictional Gurkha paratroopers. It's a fair objection, and an unresolved one. What isn't disputed is that the fake brigade existed convincingly enough on paper and in German intelligence files to be treated as a genuine variable in the defense of an entire theater. The war in Italy kept grinding forward, and the human cost kept mounting on both sides of the myth. In September 1944, at San Marino, rifleman Sher Bahadur Thapa manned a Bren gun alone on an exposed ridge for 2 hours, covering his company's retreat under direct German fire. When his ammunition ran out, he charged into no man's land to drag 2 wounded comrades to safety, succeeding both times before being killed on his final trip back. His Victoria Cross was presented to his mother, Lachua Kumari, in a village in Nepal that he never saw again. 2 months earlier, at Monte San Bartolo, rifleman Thaman Gurung had done something almost identical in spirit. Repeatedly exposing himself on an open, bullet-swept skyline, he emptied Tommy gun magazines and threw grenades into German slit trenches to save his own ambushed platoon, knowing each time he crossed the ridge that he was doing it in full view of the guns waiting for him. His patrol escaped. He didn't survive it. His Victoria Cross, like Sher Bahadur Thapa's, was posthumous. By April 1945, the war had shifted from silent infiltration to something closer to mechanized shock assault. At Medicina, the 43rd Gurkha Lorried Brigade rode straight into the town inside kangaroos. Sherman tanks with their turrets stripped out and converted into armored personnel carriers. Tanks from the 1420th King's Hussars blasted holes through stone walls with their main guns, and Gurkha infantry poured through the rubble into room-to-room combat against the German 4th Parachute Division. The town fell in a matter of hours. In gratitude, the Hussars adopted crossed kukris onto their own regimental badge, an honor that had nothing to do with propaganda and everything to do with what they'd watched their infantry do at close range. Germany surrendered in Italy 3 weeks later, at Padua, and Gurkha units in the field marked the moment by listening to King George VI's victory address, translated into Nepali. Not every use of the reputation was so clean-cut. Later that same year, When Gurkha troops were deployed to Athens to contain a communist uprising, British commanders, worried about the optics of Nepalese soldiers policing a European political crisis, issued an order forbidding the 1/9th Gurkha Rifles from using their kukris at all. Gurkha officers reportedly considered it close to insubordination. The same weapon that had broken German lines at Wadi Akarit was now being treated as a public relations liability rather than a legitimate tool of war. Then came the accounting. In 1947, the tripartite agreement split the 10 Gurkha regiments between the British and newly independent Indian armies. Gurkha veterans returned home with a reputation now legendary on 2 continents, and a pension roughly a fraction of what a British soldier of equal rank received. That disparity, and the 16 rupees figure the Germans had once used in propaganda leaflets to encourage Gurkha desertion, became the seed of a legal fight that would take until the 2000s to resolve, when a UK High Court campaign finally secured settlement rights and pension parity for British Gurkha veterans. And the myth itself never really retired. In 1982, during the Falklands War, British forces deliberately reused the same wartime rumor that approaching Gurkhas practiced cannibalism against Argentine conscripts. It reportedly triggered panic and near mutiny in the defending positions, nearly 4 decades after the original propaganda campaign had been dreamed up in a converted Cairo brothel. Field Marshal Sam Manekshaw, who served alongside Gurkha units for decades, put the reputation more simply than any intelligence file ever managed. If a man says he isn't afraid of dying, he's either lying or he's a Gurkha. Rudolf Schneider kept that kukri on his mantle for 68 years. By the time he talked about it publicly, most of the men who might have corroborated his account, on either side, were gone. What remained was the object itself, real, physical, undeniable, sitting in a German veteran's home decades after the war that produced it. The paratroopers he might have feared that same year, the ones supposedly training somewhere behind Allied lines for a mass drop into the Balkans, were never real. Not one parachute was ever issued to them, because the unit existed only in forged documents, fake radio chatter, and a scattering of deliberately misplaced insignia patches in Cairo cafe tables. But the fear those paratroopers generated was real enough to keep German divisions pinned in place, away from fronts where they might have made a difference, including indirectly the beaches the Allies would land on in Normandy a year later. The knife was genuine. The army wasn't. Both of them did exactly what they were built to do.